The Titanic is sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean right now. We know exactly where it is. We've sent cameras down, we've sent submarines, we've sent tourists. So why hasn't anyone just brought it back up? It seems like the obvious move. The most famous ship in history, sitting on the ocean floor, turn it into a museum, charge admission, you'd make a fortune, and people have tried. Over the past century, engineers, billionaires, and salvage companies have proposed dozens of plans to raise the Titanic. Some were creative, some were completely insane, and every single one of them failed. Here's why. The Titanic rests about 12,500 feet below the surface of the North Atlantic. That's roughly 2.5 miles straight down. To put that in perspective, if you stack the Empire State Building on top of itself more than 8 times, it still wouldn't reach the wreck from the surface. At that depth, the water pressure is around 6,000 pounds per square inch. That's roughly 400 times the pressure you feel standing on a beach right now. Your lungs would collapse instantly. A normal submarine hull would crumple like a soda can. To get a sense of what that actually means in practice, the deepest a human being can scuba dive, even with specialized equipment and mixed gases, is around 1,000 feet. That's a world record. The Titanic sits at 12 times that depth. The pressure down there is so extreme that materials behave differently. Metal warps, seals fail. Engineering that works perfectly at the surface becomes unreliable, and engineering that's merely good becomes lethal. Only a handful of submersibles in the world are rated to operate at that depth, and even those have strict dive limits, require years of maintenance, and cost extraordinary amounts of money to build. Getting a single person down to the Titanic and back is one of the most difficult technical operations in deep-sea exploration. Getting equipment down there that can do physical work, attach cables, cut steel, rig lifting points is an entirely different level of problem. And in June of 2023, the world saw exactly what that pressure can do when something goes wrong. The Titan submersible, carrying 5 people down to visit the Titanic, suffered a catastrophic implosion. The carbon fiber hull collapsed in a fraction of a second. Everyone on board was killed instantly. The force was so extreme that the entire vessel was reduced to fragments scattered across the ocean floor. That's what 6,000 pounds per square inch does to a purpose-built deep-sea submersible. Now imagine trying to attach cables, rig lifting equipment, and raise an entire ship in those conditions, in complete darkness, in near-freezing water, 2.5 miles below the nearest breath of air. But let's say you solve the pressure problem. Let's say you build equipment that can handle it, that can operate reliably at the bottom of the ocean. You've still got another problem. Weight. The Titanic displaces over 52,000 tons. That's the weight of roughly 36,000 cars. No crane on Earth can lift that. No cable system ever built could handle that kind of load from that depth. The tensile strength required to pull something that heavy through 2.5 miles of water doesn't exist in any material we currently manufacture at that scale. And even if you could somehow generate enough upward force, the ship itself would fall apart the moment you tried. Because here's the thing most people don't realize. The Titanic isn't sitting down there in one piece. It broke in half as it sank. The bow and the stern are separated by about 2,000 feet of open ocean floor. The bow section looks surprisingly intact in photographs. You can make out the railings, the windows, the shape of the deck, but the stern is barely recognizable. It's a twisted, compressed pile of steel that doesn't look like part of a ship anymore. And even the bow, which appears solid from the outside, is incredibly fragile. The steel has been weakened by over a century of corrosion. Entire sections of railing have already collapsed. The decks are slowly buckling inward. The hull plates, which were nearly 1 inch thick when the ship was built, have been thinned to a fraction of that by a century of saltwater and biological decay. If you attached a cable to the hull and started pulling upward, the ship wouldn't rise. It would disintegrate. The steel would tear apart like wet paper. The cable would rip straight through what's left of the hull, and you'd bring up nothing but twisted fragments. And there's another problem people rarely mention. The Titanic isn't just sitting on the ocean floor. Parts of it are buried in it. The bow section drove into the seabed when it hit bottom, and over the decades, sediment has built up around and inside the hull. The ship is partially embedded in the ocean floor itself. Even if the structure could somehow survive the stress of being lifted, you'd first have to break the suction created by a century of silt packing itself around the hull. That alone would require forces that would tear the weakened steel apart, so you can't lift it as one piece. You can't lift it as 2 pieces, and you definitely can't lift it in the condition it's in now. But that hasn't stopped people from coming up with some truly wild ideas. One of the most famous proposals suggested filling the wreck with ping pong balls, millions and millions of them. The theory was that all those tiny air-filled spheres would create enough buoyancy to float the ship to the surface. It's actually a clever idea on paper. The physics of buoyancy are real. Enough air-filled volume displacing enough water really could generate lift. But here's the problem. At 6,000 pounds per square inch, every single ping pong ball would be crushed flat the instant it reached the wreck, completely useless. The depth kills the idea before it even starts. Another plan proposed injecting the hull with petroleum jelly to displace the water and create buoyancy. Someone else suggested encasing the entire ship in a giant block of ice, which would theoretically float it to the surface. Engineers actually calculated what that would require. The answer was 500,000 tons of liquid nitrogen pumped down to the seafloor. That's not practical. And then there was the plan from a 1,976 novel patch. The holes in the hull fill the ship with compressed air and the Titanic rockets to the surface like a submarine blowing its ballast tanks. Great scene. Dramatic movie poster. But it was written when people still believed the ship sank in one piece. It didn't. And even if it had, compressed air at that depth would require pressures that no century-old hull could possibly contain. None of these ideas would work. Not even close. But someone did manage to bring part of the Titanic to the surface, and the story of how it happened is almost as dramatic as the sinking itself. In 1994, a salvage company spotted a massive section of the ship's outer hull lying in the debris field between the two halves. It was a piece of the starboard side, roughly the size of a bus, with 4 portholes still intact. 3 of them still had glass in them. They called it the big piece, and they decided to bring it home. The first attempt came in 1996. The plan was to attach diesel-filled flotation bags to the section, inflate them, and slowly float the 15-ton fragment to the surface. They had 3 expedition ships on site, 2 full-size cruise ships circled nearby, packed with paying spectators, descendants of Titanic survivors, and celebrities. Thousands of people stood at the rails as the flotation bags were released, and the big piece began its 2-hour ascent from the bottom. The bags broke the surface. The crowd cheered, and then a hurricane arrived. The weather tore through the recovery site. The lines holding the big piece snapped, and the 15-ton section of hull plummeted back to the bottom of the Atlantic, 2.5 miles down, right back where it started. The mission was abandoned. 2 years later, in 1998, they went back. New plan, better equipment, more preparation. This time, when the big piece broke the surface, it stayed. It was carefully pulled onto a recovery vessel, and today it's on permanent display at the Titanic exhibition in Las Vegas, where over 22 million people have come to see it. But here's the reality of what that one recovery actually took. 4 years, 2 full expeditions, millions of dollars, a hurricane, and the kind of luck you can't plan for, and the piece weighed 15 tons. The full ship is over 52,000. Over the decades, salvage teams have recovered more than 5,500 artifacts from the wreck site. Plates, jewelry, coins, a violin, engine telegraphs, personal belongings that spent almost a century on the ocean floor. Each recovery required specialized submersibles that cost tens of thousands of dollars per dive. And every single one of those objects came from the debris field scattered between the 2 halves of the ship, not from inside the hull itself. But while humans argue about what to save, something else is quietly eating the Titanic alive. If you've ever seen footage of the wreck, you've probably noticed the strange formations hanging from the hull. They look like reddish-brown icicles made of rust. Scientists call them rusticles. Rusticles are created by colonies of bacteria that feed on iron. They latch onto the steel, consume it, and leave behind fragile hollow tubes that can grow several feet long. When you touch one, it crumbles to dust, and when it falls away, it takes a piece of the Titanic with it. The process is relentless. It never pauses. It never slows down. Every surface of the ship that's exposed to seawater is being consumed 24 hours a day by organisms too small to see. In 2010, researchers discovered something remarkable living inside those rusticles, a species of bacteria that had never been found anywhere else on Earth. They named it Halomonas titanicae, the salt-loving bacteria of the Titanic. This organism is specifically adapted to consume the ship's steel. It creates tiny mounds of corrosion that eat deeper and deeper into the hull plates. And it's not alone. Scientists have identified over 27 different strains of bacteria living in and around the wreck, all of them contributing to the breakdown. The Titanic has become its own ecosystem, a community of organisms whose entire existence depends on consuming a ship. Scientists estimate that the Titanic is losing hundreds of pounds of iron every single day. The hull is getting thinner, support beams are weakening, entire sections of deck have already collapsed into the interior of the ship. Features that were clearly visible in photographs from the 1980s are now buried under rubble or gone entirely. At the current rate of decay, some researchers believe the Titanic could be completely gone within 20 to 30 years, others give it a century, but the outcome is the same. The ship is disappearing, and there is nothing anyone can do to stop it. And honestly, a lot of people think that's exactly how it should be. Because beyond all the engineering impossibilities and the biological decay, there is another reason the Titanic has never been raised. One that has nothing to do with technology or bacteria or money. It's a grave. More than 1,500 people died when the Titanic sank on the 15th of April, 1912. Most of them went down with the ship. Their bodies were never recovered. When Robert Ballard first found the wreck in 1985, his initial reaction wasn't celebration. After a few moments of excitement, the reality of what he was looking at settled over the crew. They held a moment of silence on the deck of their research vessel, standing in the darkness above the remains of 1,500 people. And what Ballard saw on the ocean floor made the weight of that moment even heavier. The bodies themselves are gone. Over a century in the deep ocean, the cold water and marine organisms consumed them entirely. Nothing remains of the people themselves, except their shoes. Leather contains chemicals that sea creatures avoid. So scattered across the debris field, exactly where passengers fell, are pairs of shoes, sitting undisturbed on the sediment. A woman's shoes next to a child's, side by side, exactly where they came to rest over 100 years ago. In some places, shoes sit in pairs with a clear space between them, the shape of a person who was once there and is now gone. The outline of a body that the ocean slowly erased, but the shoes preserved. Researchers who have spent time examining the debris field describe these as among the most difficult things they've ever encountered. Not the twisted steel, not the scale of the wreckage, the shoes. Because the shoes are personal, they are the last physical connection to individual human beings who boarded a ship in 1912 and never arrived where they were going. That's all that's left. Since the discovery, multiple governments have moved to protect the site. In 2012, exactly 1 century after the sinking, the wreck was officially declared a protected site. The United States and the United Kingdom ratified a separate treaty in 2019 that specifically regulates who can visit the wreck and what they can remove. Both governments now have the power to grant or deny licenses for any activity within 1 kilometer of the site. The wreck is treated with the same respect as a cemetery, because that's what it is. So the real answer to the question is layered. We haven't raised the Titanic because we can't. The depth is too extreme, the pressure is too crushing, the ship is too heavy, too fragile, and too far gone. But we also haven't raised it because we shouldn't. Somewhere in that wreck, tangled in the corroding steel and settling into the sediment, are the last traces of people who never made it home. Families who sold everything they owned for a ticket to a new life. Workers who saved for months to afford a third-class fare. People who boarded the largest ship ever built and believed, because everyone told them to believe, that nothing could go wrong. A first-class passenger who wrote a letter to his wife from the ship's library the night before the sinking, describing how smooth the crossing had been. A 14-year-old boy traveling alone to meet his father in New York. A newlywed couple on their honeymoon who had debated whether to take the Titanic or wait for a later ship. They chose the Titanic because it was supposed to be the safest vessel afloat. None of them made it. The ocean is taking the Titanic back, piece by piece, day by day. The bacteria will keep eating, the steel will keep thinning, the decks will keep collapsing. And in a few decades, there may be nothing left at all, just a faint impression on the sea floor where a ship once rested. For the 1,500 people who went down with it, maybe that's the most fitting end there is. Not a museum, not an attraction. Just the quiet, deep, and time doing what time does.